Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Enemy of the State podcast. Now in today's episode it's going to be much more philosophical than normal. I'm going to be talking about a section from Friedrich Nietzsche's book, Twilight of the Idols, and tying it into a few other ideas. Now the reason I'm going to be going over this particular section is largely the same reason that people read philosophy in general. It's not only interesting, but it speaks to some deeper truth about life. And it helps you so that you don't run headlong into every obstacle that comes your way. Now, in this particular section, he's talking about the greatest error of humanity. And really, he covers the four greatest errors of humanity. But the first one that he lists, he calls the greatest error. And I'm only going to be covering that one because if I was covering all four, this would be like a 2-hour podcast. And there's no way that I'm ready to do that. So I'm only going to be going over the first one, but there is plenty to say on it. And the reason that I'm going to be covering it is because it took me 3 to 4 days to really wrap my head around it and understand it. And you almost have to have read some of Friedrich Nietzsche's other works to understand how this particular section fits into the whole cohesive web of philosophy that he tries to articulate. Now, so in this section, when he's talking about the first greatest error of humanity, or the greatest error, there's 2 sections to it. And I'm going to summarize the first section, and then I'll read the second section and go through it piece by piece. Because the first section, it's more just an overview of what he's going to be talking about with a little bit of an example. So he says that the greatest error of humanity is confusing cause and effect. And he gives an example of a man named Karenina who wrote a book that said that if you want to have a long, joyous life, you need to eat a skimpy diet. And he gave examples of a skimpy diet. He wrote about it. And it's because he saw his skimpy diet as being the reason for his long life. But he didn't consider that it was his slow metabolism and his low expenditure of energy. Whereas Nietzsche says that if the scholars of his day attempted to eat the skimpy diet, with their rapid expenditure of nervous energy, they just could not do it. It would just degrade their life. And it wouldn't surprise me if Karenina was a bit of a statist, certainly not an anarchist, because the way that he looks at things is from a more tyrannical perspective, where Nietzsche is saying that, well, the reason for his long life is because he ate a proper diet for him. It was his slow metabolism. It was his low expenditure of energy that allowed him to eat a skimpy diet and have a long life, because it was tailored for him. So instead of telling other people to do what works for him, just tell them to eat a proper diet. And of course you can look at what foods do to your body, because there are certain truths to, or certain commonalities around what foods will do to a human body in general. But as far as what every person needs, that changes. There are nuances there. And so you should just eat a proper diet, consume the amount of calories that you should be having. If there's an athlete that consumes a skimpy diet, their life is only going to get worse. So they need to eat a proper diet. And this kind of abstraction really speaks to the larger message that Nietzsche tries to convey in general when he's talking about truth, where he says that religion and morality or moral philosophers will try to preach a structure. And you'll see this as I read exactly what I'm talking about. But Nietzsche says that maybe giving people tenets for truth is not the way to go about it, but instead stepping back and saying, well, what absolute truth is striving to bring humanity to the point of maximal joyousness and flourishing. And this is different from a lot of the ways that other philosophers thought about it, where they tried to get more specific with it and say, well, what is the morality that we need to follow? And Nietzsche says, well, there isn't a set morality that you can really rest your laurels on, because if you do that, then you're deifying yourself. You're saying that you've discovered the higher values and there's nothing else to be discovered. And I'll get into reading this, because as I read through this, I'll explain everything that I've been going on about so far a bit more. But you're going to see a reference to this slow metabolism later on, which is why I bring this up, and I'm trying to really hammer the point home here, that you have to look at where the slow metabolism fits into Carnaro's idea of how his life has worked out so far. So he's taking his skimpy diet and saying that led to his long life. But what led to his skimpy diet was the slow metabolism and a low expenditure of energy. So with that in mind, I'm going to read through the first paragraph here. So this second section I'm going to read has 3 paragraphs. I'm going to read the first and really dive into that deep. And then the second is more of an example of the error of confusing cause and effect. And then the third is a nice little summarization. So the first paragraph is: the most general formula that lies at the basis of every religion and morality is do such and such, don't do such and such, and that will make you happy, or else. Every morality, every religion is this imperative. I call it the great original sin of reason, the immortal unreason. In my mouth, this formula changes into its opposite. First example of my reevaluation of all values. Well-constituted people, happy ones, have to do certain acts and instinctively shrink away from other acts. They import the orderliness which is evident in their physiology into their relations to people and things. In a formula, their virtue is the effect of their happiness. Long life and many offspring are not the reward of virtue. Instead, virtue itself is that slow metabolism that, among other things, also has a long life, many offspring, and in short, cornerism as its consequence. Cornerism is talking about Carnaro. So, when he's talking about religion and general morality, and he says that you do such and such, don't do such and such, or else. And that's how you be happy. So when you're looking at a religion or a moral philosopher and they're giving you tenets to follow, that's what he's talking about there, where they're telling you what to do, they're telling you what not to do, and this will make you happy, or else you won't be happy and your life will just fade away into chaos. And so this happiness that he's trying to reach, this is where you have to go back into beyond good and evil, and you have to say, well, what is the true moral imperative that Nietzsche has found? Because he doesn't reiterate it here. And the moral imperative that he devises, that he comes up with, is that you have to have a long obedience to a single morality, to a single moral path. Otherwise, you'll lose respect for yourself and come to grief. And so if you follow a single morality, then you'll gain respect for yourself, you'll have self-respect, and you'll be happy. So when he's talking about how well-constituted people, happy ones, have to do certain acts and instinctively shrink away from other acts, what he's saying is that there are certain things, there are certain wills that we have that are directed in the right way. They're directed towards the right end. And so what this is getting at is that the collection of wills that people have are not all going to be pointed in the same direction. And so there comes an element of objection where you have to shrink away from doing certain acts and you have to do other acts. And it's because people aren't perfect. Their wills are not going to be completely in line with the moral direction that they want to go. And how do you find the moral direction you want to go? Well, it takes introspection. It takes learning about who you are and what exactly your impulses are trying to do with you. Because if you don't figure that out, if you don't know where you're trying to go, and then look at where your impulses are taking you, the current of your impulses will just drag you in whatever direction. It's something I think I've said before, is that if you don't start to pick up a paddle and row in your own direction, the current is going to pull you right over the edge of the waterfall. And I think that that holds up pretty true. When they give in to every whim that they have, all of a sudden, they're no longer in control of what they're doing and where they're headed in life. And so when he talks about importing the orderliness, which is evident in their physiology, into their relations to people and things, what he's saying is that when your will is ordered with your moral direction, when when all of your actions are geared towards the same direction, that's when you're happy. And so happiness is something that arises out of this orderliness. And you know what it's like when people aren't ordered, when there is chaos in their life. And we all have chaos to some degree, but it becomes very obvious when somebody is just bathed in chaos. And you see that they end up giving in to every whim that they have, and they don't really know the direction that they're going. It can change on a dime. And these are people who never really find what they're looking for because they never really know what they're looking for. They never know how to get where it is they want to get because they don't know where they want to get. They just have some very loose idea. And this is the problem with hedonists. When they strive for happiness, it's like, well, are you striving for superficial happiness in the moment, or are you striving for long-term happiness? And do you know how to get that long-term happiness? And most hedonists, it's the same thing like nihilists. The answer is no. They have no idea. So when he says in a formula, their virtue is the effect of their happiness, you have to define terms here. So when you're looking at virtue, virtue is when you can call yourself virtuous, or when all of your wills are lined up with your moral direction. And the way that you become happy is, like I said, by having a long obedience to a single morality. It's by having that moral direction. And I think the word orderliness is probably the most important in this whole section, if not at least this paragraph. Because when you think of orderliness, it radiates a commonality among man. So what does it mean to be ordered? Well, I think that for this, a good example is if I go to a book that I'm reading by Leo Tolstoy called Anna Karenina. Now, this was from a live stream a while ago where I was trying to find the name of a book that I remembered reading back in like 6th or 7th grade. And Anna Karenina is not the book, but I saw it was by Tolstoy and I bought it, and I didn't realize it was 900 pages, but I'm already, 100 pages into it, whatever. So I'm going to read it, and it's very fascinating. But it's because there's a deeper truth to the book. Now, the very first sentence of the book speaks to this orderliness that Nietzsche's talking about, and it offers a deeper understanding to it. So I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the first sentence of the book is something to the effect of, every happy family is alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in their own unique way. And it's because when you have people who are going in the same direction and they're happy going in a direction, it's because there is some commonality among all people going towards a certain direction. And I get that that's very confusing, so I'll try to word that better. So the end goal of morality is truth. When you're striving for truth, there's only a very minimal range of directions that you can be going in to get to that truth. But when you're not aiming for truth, when you're unsure of what you're aiming for, when there's disorder or chaos, you can go in any direction. But to be aiming towards truth, to be aiming in a direction that is sustainable, but happiness is an effect of that, there's a very, very finite number of ways to get there. And so that's why happy families are alike, because it's not only that they're ordered and they're going in a single direction, but it's that when you look at happy families or happy people, that happiness is geared, well, that happiness is born out of a moral obedience that is geared in a certain direction. And there is a strong commonality between that direction among all of the people, or the families, or the nations, or cultures, however far you want to abstract it. Disorder is almost the default. It's almost like that if you do nothing, that's what you fall into, is disorder, because you become victim to every impulse, whim, and will that you have. So when he says that their virtue is the effect of their happiness, now you have to think again, happiness, a long obedience to a single morality, but happiness is a gauge that you're moving in the right direction. Happiness is that thing that makes you feel comfortable knowing that you're going in the proper direction. And so when you're virtuous, it's because you know you're going in the right direction due to your happiness. So when he says that virtue is the effect of happiness, if you're unhappy, then you don't have faith in the moral direction that you're going. And so you're more inclined to be subjected to every individual will and impulse that you have, because if the direction you're going you don't see any real value or truth in, then you're more inclined to try other directions. And that leads to somebody not being virtuous. That leads to somebody not being happy. And they're not virtuous because they're not happy, because their gauge that they're moving in the right direction is saying that they're not moving in the right direction. They need to try something else. They need to go in another moral path. And so this changes their moral beliefs, making them not virtuous. It makes it so that their virtue is very weak. Long life and many offspring are not the reward of virtue. Instead, virtue itself is that slow metabolism. So virtue is, this ties into Carnaro, where the slow metabolism led to his skimpy diet, which then led to his long life, because it was proper for him. Now, virtue is that slow metabolism that, among other things, also has a long life, many offspring, and in short, cornerism as its consequence. And so, what this is saying is that people will take virtue as being the end goal, where they're like, well, if I'm virtuous, then that's how I get to being happy. I need to be virtuous. But you have to ask, how do you be virtuous? And how do you gauge if you're being virtuous in the right way? How do you gauge if you're truly being virtuous? So to say that a long life and many offspring are the reward of virtue is to say that you have to be virtuous to have a long life and many offspring. But that's not necessarily the case. It just so happens that if you are virtuous, then a long life and many offspring will follow. But to have a long life and many offspring, you don't necessarily have to be virtuous. So just to try to summarize this first paragraph here, what he's saying is that when you have virtue and you have happiness, happiness is the gauge that you are being virtuous. And unhappiness throws you into disorder and chaos. And so to be happy, you have to have a long obedience to a single morality. You have to feel as if it's the proper morality to be going towards. And this is why he's talking about you have to do certain acts and instinctively shrink away from other acts, because you're going to have wills that are sending you in the wrong direction. So now the second paragraph here, and we'll pick up with that idea again when I read the third paragraph, but the second paragraph, he says, the church and morality say a race, a people, is destroyed by vice and luxury. My reconstituted reason says, when a people is perishing, physiologically degenerating, the effects of this are vice and luxury. That is the need for stronger and stronger, more and more frequent stimuli, the kind of stimuli that are familiar to every exhausted nature. This young man gets prematurely pale and flabby. His friends say this is due to such and such a sickness. I say the fact that he got sick, that he did not resist the sickness, was already the effect of an impoverished life and inherited exhaustion. The newspaper reader says, "This party is destroying itself by making such a mistake." My higher politics says, "A party that makes such mistakes is over. It no longer has sure instincts." And so I'll just define here real quick vice and luxury. So vice is the more and more frequent stimuli, and luxury is the more and more powerful stimuli. And so you have to wonder why somebody would be craving something like that in the first place. But the overall idea here is that you often don't see what ends up bubbling below the surface. People often look at the superficial aspect of a lot of things, and they'll say that, and this is where people get the idea of causality. It's more a limitation of man's intellect. So when you think about causality and you think about identity, that's really a limitation of man's intellect, because to say that something was caused by something else says that you don't know what caused the thing that you're saying was the cause. Or at the very least, you're saying it's not important to identify. And so this is where people fall into the trap of free will, because people think that they're just acting on their own volition. They think that their will has some amount of freedom to it, that their consciousness is free to will as it wants. And then to abstract that a little bit more, to think that they themselves, that the I is responsible for certain causes, or it causes certain things. And all this really is that they're unable to see what it was in them that caused them to act in a certain way. And this is because people are a biological product, most severely from their parents, but also from their ancestors. And then they're also a product of the degree to which they were last enculturated. So they're a product of the culture. And then you have experience that gets run through, it's taken in through sensory input, run through the patterns ingrained in the psyche and formulated in the psyche. And this helps to strengthen certain patterns, create new patterns, weaken old patterns. And this is the human experience. But people see limitations on how much they know because we're not omniscient. And so they immediately just assume, well, I have free will. Well, I do what I want. I am the cause within myself. Things are able to have a cause within themselves. And that never really sits right in an existentialist view of the world. So thinking of it more where man is not the measure of all things, thinking of it in more of a realistic sense where you have life and nature as two separate entities and very different, almost polar opposites, things become a lot more clear. So you see reality for much more of what it is as opposed to your perception of what it is. So when he's talking about like political parties, let me give you an example here. So when the Green New Deal came up, and I get that this isn't the best example, but when the Green New Deal came up, and I'll give a better example after this, but when the Green New Deal came up, people were like, oh, this is a sign that the party is going down, the Democratic Party is falling into the pit of socialism and eventual communism because they're trying to tyrannize over industries, they're trying to tyrannize over individuals. And the Green New Deal is not the cause of that degradation. That degradation was already bubbling under the surface, but also above the surface for people that were largely paying attention, and that led to the Green New Deal. But people will look at the Green New Deal and say that that's why the party's going down. And you can say this about almost any specific instance that you could say a political party was going downhill. However, I think that a better example is something like the Soviets, where you look at how the Soviets didn't even really have a written code of law. I think it was from 1917 to 1921. But they didn't have much that was set in stone, so the people who were in charge could just enact any law that they wanted. They could impose force on a peaceful person anytime that they wanted for any reason, and it was justified because they deified the state. They deified themselves, and not the people in the society, but the people leading the society deified themselves. They said that they know what absolute truth is, and there are no higher values that have yet to be discovered. There is no divinity in the individual. There is none of that. There is no amount of the individual that can control their own life, so they need the state to do it. But then you can obviously look back in historical records and you can see how the system that Lenin set up led to the horrors that Stalin enacted. And it's not like Stalin caused, I mean, Stalin did certainly to a degree cause a lot of the pain and the suffering, but why was he able to cause that pain and the suffering? It's because of what Lenin did. And that's, I think, a better example, because a lot of the communists, the Soviet sympathizers nowadays, the democratic socialists, they'll want to praise Lenin and crucify Stalin, but you can't separate them. One came before the other and set up the system that the other took advantage of. So that's a better example. So now, reading on the last paragraph here, every mistake in every sense is the effect of degenerate instincts, of a disintegrated will. This virtually defines the bad. Everything good is instinct, and consequently is easy, necessary, free. Exertion is an objection. The god is typically different from the hero. And this is where the idea comes in that, okay, so this last paragraph really is where I struggled with a lot of the understanding, but now I think that I get it. So when he says every mistake in every sense is the effect of degenerate instincts of a disintegrated will, this virtually defines the bad. What he's saying is that people will generally have instincts that go against or are not particularly directed towards their moral direction, where they want to be headed, where they think truth is at the end of the rainbow. And when you have these instincts that are pulling you in other directions, when you have wills that are pulling you in other directions, that's a disintegration between your will and your morality, where you are trying to go. So this virtually defines the bad. So when you have instincts that pull you away from that moral direction, those instincts could be considered bad because things that fall in line with your moral track are good. So when he says everything good is instinct and consequently is easy, necessary, and free, here what he's talking about is that if something is leading you in the right direction, if your instincts are pulling you in the right direction, then that's considered good, because everything good is instinct. He's talking about it in a perspective where your will is not disintegrated. If your will is not disintegrated, if every single will that you have is aimed in the same direction that you want to be going, then that's when it's good and it's easy and it's necessary and it's free. And there was a psychoanalyst, and I can't remember exactly who it was, maybe it was Carl Rogers, who was saying that if you can turn over every stone in your psyche and you can see what it is that your impulses are trying to do with you, then, and you can constrain them to that moral track that you're trying to go on, then that's how you become a complete person. Because now every single will and instinct that you have will be aimed in the same direction. But people aren't like that. People will have wills that stray them to other directions, that stray them into chaos. And this is where the last line comes in. The god is typically different from the hero. So man is not God. You cannot deify yourself and say that every instinct you have is good. You need to be your own hero. And let's just look at some people through history who did deify themselves, who thought of themselves as gods. You have Stalin, you have Hitler, you have Mao, you have Pol Pot. I mean, I could go on. You have tyrants through history who set up regimes that thought that they were so righteous that they were all that the people needed. And if you look at heroes throughout history, they're people who, and even just archetypical heroes, they're people who objected to evil. They saw the direction that evil was going, and they pulled it back into the moral track towards good. They tried to set that right. And people are not perfect. So people need to be their own hero. That's what he's talking about here, is that people need to be their own hero. You have to find your impulses that are throwing you into disorder and pull them back together. So that's all for this episode of the podcast. I hope that I explained everything well enough. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate the support. This is only the second episode, but I'm definitely going to be doing more. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.